The first crack of betrayal struck Eleanor before she had even fully glimpsed the night's supposed joy. The air in the palace chamber was thick with the scent of beeswax and lingering roses, yet it carried a chill that no hearth could warm. Her wedding gown, a cascade of ivory silk and delicate lace, clung to her in the flickering candlelight, each fold a testament to careful planning, to expectation, to a future she had believed certain. And yet, certainty had abandoned her. She had entered her husband's presence with a fluttering heart, imagining whispers of admiration from servants and guests alike, only to meet a gaze that seemed distant, veiled, impenetrable. Duke Sebastian, tall and immaculately poised, inclined his head in a formal greeting, yet the warmth she had dared to hope for was absent. There was distance in the lines of his mouth, an unspoken hesitation in the way he avoided her eyes, and in that instant Eleanor's pulse shivered with the cold understanding that this night, this sacred beginning, might already be broken. The ballroom had emptied into a quiet hush, save for the gentle rustle of servants taking their leave and the distant echo of noble chatter receding down the marbled corridors. Eleanor had expected a private exchange, a tender word, perhaps a touch that would confirm Sebastian's devotion. Instead, she encountered silence. The Duke's hand, gloved and rigid, barely grazed hers as he guided her toward the grand settee near the hearth. It was as though a wall, invisible but impenetrable, had risen between them, one that neither charm nor affection could traverse. She felt it immediately, a rejection not of her person, but of the faith she had invested entirely in the promises of a name and title. And it was more devastating precisely because it carried no malice, only the chilling suggestion of indifference, a void where love should have been. Eleanor's mind, quick and unyielding, began to assemble every small interaction of the day into a mosaic of imagined betrayal. The way he had lingered only slightly too long over his wine before bowing to a neighboring guest. The subtle furrow in his brow when her maid spoke in polite frivolity about the upcoming festivities. Each gesture, she convinced herself, had been a coded message of secret disdain. Her imagination, sharpened by disappointment, painted vivid pictures of duplicity, whispered rumors and clandestine indifference that may never have existed. She had entered marriage believing in devotion, and the absence of it felt like a wound drawn open in the first hour of her vows. The Duke, seemingly unaware of the storm within her, rose and moved toward the window, the moonlight catching his profile in stark relief. Eleanor's gaze followed him, and in that moment she saw a distance deeper than the corridors that separated them, a solitude that mocked her yearning. The realization struck her fully. She was alone in the grandest hall of England, a bride in all but spirit, her heart laid bare to the cold scrutiny of fate. Shame, subtle and insidious, began to creep along her spine. How would the household perceive her? How would the servants speak of her composure, or lack thereof, behind her back? She had dreamed of a night bathed in whispered endearments, of a husband's hand warm upon hers, of a private communion that marked the sanctity of their vows. Instead, she felt exposed, abandoned, a solitary figure caught in the echo of grandeur that offered no comfort. A servant, discreet as ever, entered with the faint clink of silver and glass, placing a cup of perfumed tea on a side table. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, not from the drink itself, but from the ritual it represented, the meticulous, polite gestures that could never fill the void of genuine attention. She sipped, the bitter liquid sliding down her throat, sharp as the pang of her own conviction. She could not endure this night, she thought, not with a duke whose affection seemed so carefully withheld, whose expressions were measured as if weighed against some invisible ledger of propriety. Her chest ached with the quiet desperation of one who has entered a union expecting sanctuary, only to encounter a silence that spoke louder than accusation. The fire, a grand blaze in the hearth, cast long shadows that danced across the walls, shadows that seemed to mock her trembling composure. Eleanor's eyes, wide and searching, traced the ornate carvings of the room, each figure frozen in the eternal gesture of grace or reverence, yet all cold and unyielding reflections of the coldness she perceived in Sebastian. The noble woman within her recoiled from the thought of enduring a life of formality without warmth, of living each day in a gilded cage of polite restraint where the most intimate of promises could be withheld with the weight of a glance. The tears she had hoped to stifle came unbidden, pricking her lashes, threatening to spill in a manner that would betray her dignity before the one she had vowed to love and before the walls that had witnessed centuries of ceremony. Sebastian's voice, low and measured, finally cut the stillness. "Lady Eleanor," he said, each syllable deliberate, formal, "the evening has been long. Rest if you will." No softness, no inflection of personal concern, only the weight of courtesy. Eleanor's heart stuttered with pain. It was as though the very man she had entrusted with her hopes had issued a sentence of emotional exile, polite but irrevocable. She rose slowly, her movements careful, as though she might break if she moved too quickly, and gathered the skirts of her dress with trembling hands. The floor beneath her feet felt suddenly too vast, too polished, too indifferent to the sorrow she carried like a secret burden. She made for the door, the echo of her slippers on the marble a solitary percussion marking her retreat. A dozen unspoken thoughts collided within her: anger, grief, longing, disbelief. Each step felt like a negotiation with herself, each breath a muted rebellion against a world that seemed to demand composure in the face of devastation. The hallway stretched before her, opulent and yet alien, and Eleanor felt the full weight of her isolation. In the privacy of that corridor, away from the soft scrutiny of servants and the hollow grandeur of a palace built for appearances, she made a choice that would alter the course of her life. She would leave. Not with a shout, not with scandal, but with the quiet dignity of one who refuses to be diminished by silence and distance. A final glance back toward the hall revealed Sebastian, still near the window, his posture unchanged, his expression inscrutable. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor's heart wavered between hope and despair. Could it be that his detachment masked his own inner torment, some hidden grief that mirrored her own? She allowed herself a single private question before suppressing it. Some truths were not yet ready to be shared, and some wounds required the solitude of time. With measured grace, she slipped from the palace, each step deliberate, each heartbeat echoing the fragile rhythm of a dignity she refused to surrender. Outside, the night embraced her in its quiet shroud, and she walked into uncertainty, the first fracture of what was meant to be a union of hearts leaving her breathless and unresolved. The letter arrived as though summoned by fate itself, slipped beneath the garden gate in the hush of dawn, its presence both ominous and intimate. Eleanor found it while tending the roses that had become her only companions in exile, their petals trembling with dew as if in sympathy with her heart. She recognized the wax seal before she touched it, the Duke's crest, a mark of authority, precision, and a world from which she had fled. Her fingers, delicate and wary, broke the seal, and the parchment unfurled like a promise or a threat, she could not yet tell which. Inside, the words were measured, formal, yet contained a tremor she had not anticipated. Forgive the distance of a night that should have been ours. Know that my thoughts remain with you though unspoken. Sebastian. Eleanor's chest tightened. The note was a whisper, a fragment, a token that suggested remorse without offering explanation, yet it carried the weight of everything she had refused to allow herself to hope for. Days passed in a quiet rhythm of labor and reflection. The countryside manor, modest yet dignified, sheltered her from the relentless scrutiny of courtly eyes. She rose with the sun, tending her small garden, walking along the narrow streams that carved silver paths through the fields, and writing letters she would never send. Each moment alone sharpened her understanding of the distance she had placed between herself and the world she once inhabited. In solitude, grief was both companion and tormentor. She measured the absence of Sebastian in every heartbeat, in every whispered sigh of the wind across the meadows. Yet the letter, so small and so simple, had stirred a quiet, stubborn flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished, even as her pride demanded it remain hidden. It was not long before another token arrived. A single pressed violet, delicate and pale, bound with a ribbon of deep blue, the color she remembered him favoring, rested atop her writing desk, accompanied by no word save a single initial. Eleanor's breath caught. She understood at once the deliberate intimacy of such a gesture, and yet the cruelty of ambiguity that it carried. Was it an apology, a declaration, or a test of her patience and dignity? Her fingers lingered on the flower, noting the slight crispness of its petals and the faint scent that lingered despite the passing hours. 1,000 unspoken emotions stirred within her: longing, fear, defiance, and a trembling awareness that Sebastian had not forgotten, that he had not abandoned her entirely. As days turned into weeks, each token built upon the last, a silent dialogue between two hearts separated by misunderstanding, circumstance, and pride. A glove, embroidered with a fine thread of gold, appeared one morning upon the sill, a note, brief and cautious, the next, suggesting he had walked past her garden without pause, watching yet respecting her solitude. Eleanor wrestled with conflicting impulses, the desire to retreat further, to protect her wounded dignity, and the yearning to respond, to bridge the gulf that had opened on that single night when her trust had faltered. She had believed betrayal, yet each gesture now hinted at something far more complex. Perhaps a man equally captive to fear, expectation, and the conventions of a society that demanded restraint above all else. The manor staff whispered among themselves, noting the growing collection of tokens with curiosity and reverence. Eleanor, aware of their eyes, guarded her emotions carefully, speaking little, moving with composed grace. Still, the gossip of the wider world inevitably found its way to her sanctuary, carried by travelers, letters, and servants whose tongues were seldom tethered. Rumors began to swirl, delicate yet persistent, suggesting affairs where none existed, scandal where only circumstance had placed them. She bore it silently, her composure a shield against the judgmental world, yet each whispered accusation was a dagger, each rumor a weight upon the fragile framework of her dignity. It was a cruel irony. She had fled to preserve herself from imagined betrayal, only to be assaulted by the society she had sought to escape, her virtue and character dissected in absentia. One morning, as autumn's first frost kissed the garden, Eleanor sensed a change within herself. She had discovered, with both terror and wonder, that she carried life within her, a child, the living echo of her brief union with Sebastian. The revelation, private and sacred, altered the cadence of her days. She felt the future pressing upon her, not as a specter of judgment, but as a delicate responsibility, a bond that tethered her heart to both past sorrow and potential redemption. Her awareness of the child's presence deepened the complexity of the tokens she had received. Each gesture from Sebastian now carried an unknowable weight, threaded with both affection and unspoken consequence. The silence between them had grown taut with significance, each omission a question, each careful avoidance a challenge to her judgment and restraint. Evenings were long with reflection. Eleanor would sit by the fire, her hands folded over her swelling belly, and trace the wax seals and ribbons that had arrived with such care. She imagined Sebastian in the palace, pacing dimly lit halls, perhaps haunted by similar revelations, perhaps weighed by the impossibility of expression within the rigid confines of nobility. In those hours, she felt the strange intimacy of separation, the knowledge that another mind, another heart, was attempting communication in the only ways permitted by decorum and circumstance. She wrote replies in the privacy of her journal, letters of both anger and hope that would never leave her possession, letters that were as much for her own heart as for the one who inspired them. The culmination of the season's gifts came unexpectedly. A simple, silver locket appeared, containing a miniature portrait of Sebastian, painted with exquisite care. The likeness was striking, capturing both his formality and an almost imperceptible softness in the curve of his lips, the tilt of his eyes. Eleanor clasped the locket to her chest, her pulse quickening. Here, finally, was a tangible acknowledgement of intimacy, a silent confession of attachment that went beyond the polite formalities of courtly expectation. She understood in that moment that Sebastian had acted not with cruelty but with a hesitation born of his own emotional imprisonment. The miscommunication, the perceived betrayal, had been no more than the cruel accident of circumstance, magnified by pride and societal constraint. Yet the tokens, the letters, and the locket did not dissolve her uncertainty entirely. They deepened it, revealing the layers of complexity within the man she had once trusted without question and now doubted in measured glimpses. Eleanor felt herself at a crossroads. The path of retreat and solitude still called to her, yet the path of return, of confrontation with the man whose child she carried, grew ever more vivid and compelling. Her pride urged caution, her heart urged action, and the tension between them coiled tightly within her chest, a silent storm waiting for resolution. It was on a morning brushed with frost and quiet expectation that Eleanor finally resolved upon her course. She would not remain hidden, nor would she surrender entirely to fear and rumor. She would return to the palace, but not with reproach or anger. She would go with the quiet authority of her knowledge, with the undeniable evidence of life itself, and with the understanding that the balance of power had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Her decision, though unspoken, carried the weight of both dread and anticipation. The world she had left would never receive her the same, and the man she had once loved would confront realities he had scarcely imagined. As she prepared to depart, she paused among the roses that had been her confidants and her solace. Each petal, now flecked with frost, seemed to whisper a promise of courage and endurance. Eleanor's hand rested upon the locket once more, feeling the warmth of the miniature against her palm, and she drew a deep breath. The air around her seemed to thrum with possibility, the boundaries between fear and hope, pride and desire, trembling like the fragile bloom of an early frost-kissed flower. The journey back had begun, though the path remained uncertain, and the question that had haunted every heartbeat lingered, poised to confront them both. Would the truths they carried be enough to mend what had been broken, or would they be further fractured by the weight of unspoken expectation? The truth struck Eleanor like a tempest, sudden and unyielding, as though the very air around her had conspired to reveal the secret she had both feared and longed for. She had received another letter, this one heavier than any prior token, the Duke's handwriting unmistakable, flowing with the delicate precision of a man accustomed to control yet betraying a vulnerability that made her pulse stammer. The paper trembled under her fingers, though the tremor came not from her hands but from the weight of realization. Sebastian had written to confess a misunderstanding, to acknowledge the absence she had interpreted as betrayal, and to declare that every action, every pause, every distant glance had been misread, misjudged, and unintended. Her heart clenched with relief and despair, for the revelation arrived too late for the innocence of their wedding night, and yet it opened a door she dared not ignore. Days of contemplation followed, each hour stretching like a taut string of tension across the quiet halls of her countryside retreat. Eleanor read the letter repeatedly, memorizing each careful word, each inflection that hinted at suppressed emotion. The Duke's voice, restrained yet trembling beneath layers of formality, echoed in her mind. "It was never my wish to wound you, Lady Eleanor. Circumstance, pride, and fear conspired to keep my intentions concealed, yet not a moment passes in which I do not regret the distance I allowed to grow between us." Her breath hitched with the intimacy of it, the confession of a soul struggling against the rigid conventions of duty. How could a man of such decorum admit such faltering, and how could she reconcile the pain of abandonment with the evidence of his hidden remorse? The letters multiplied, subtle and careful in their delivery. A pressed lily, white as moonlight, appeared one morning upon her writing desk, accompanied by a short note. "For understanding and forgiveness when you are ready." Eleanor held the flower against her chest, sensing a life within its fragile petals, a reflection of the quiet hope stirring inside her own body. She had discovered, days prior, that she carried Sebastian's child, a secret she had guarded fiercely against the world and even against the fluttering, tentative hopes within her own heart. The realization intertwined with the tokens. Each gesture of his, previously enigmatic, now carried layered meaning. He had been reaching toward her across the gulf of misunderstanding, his restraint misread as coldness, his caution a shield against both societal judgment and private vulnerability. Evenings grew long and reflective. Eleanor would sit by the hearth, the flickering flame casting shadows upon the pages of her journal, tracing each line she had written in response to letters she would never send. She poured into these pages the complexities of her heart, her anger at the perceived betrayal, her sorrow at the solitude imposed upon her, and the tentative stirrings of love renewed by understanding. There was no rush to act, no immediate desire to return, yet the tension coiled tightly within her chest. The child she carried was a constant, gentle reminder that life, in all its fragility, pressed forward even when hearts faltered. Each movement of the tiny being within her seemed to echo the unspoken conversations between herself and Sebastian, a rhythm of connection that transcended distance and misjudgment. The wind carried the first hints of winter, crisp and biting, into the small garden where Eleanor walked each morning. She paused often, hand resting upon her swelling belly, eyes tracing the horizon beyond the meadows. She imagined Sebastian pacing the corridors of the palace, haunted by absence, constrained by pride, yearning to bridge a gulf neither had yet fully understood. The tokens he sent, the letters he penned, were delicate lifelines across that expanse of fear and misunderstanding. She realized with quiet, heartbreaking clarity that both had been captives, she to pride and shame, he to duty and decorum, each interpreting the other's silence as rejection. The tragedy of miscommunication weighed upon her, and yet it was tempered by the glimmer of hope each day delivered, subtle and insistent as sunlight through frost-laden branches. One afternoon, Eleanor walked the narrow path along the stream, the icy water whispering over stones in a rhythm that echoed her heartbeat. She paused beneath a skeletal oak, its branches stretched like pleading hands to a pale sky, and allowed herself a rare indulgence, the possibility of return, of confrontation, of reckoning. She imagined Sebastian's reaction upon discovering her, upon learning that she carried life from him, that the child within her was not only a testament to their bond but a tangible proof of love unspoken and misjudged. Her heart quickened at the thought of meeting his gaze, of speaking the truths she had held in silence for so long, and yet a shadow of fear lingered. Would he receive her with the tenderness implied in his letters, or would pride, duty, and societal expectation again conspire to keep them apart? A final, extraordinary token arrived with the first snow, a silver locket, more ornate than any previous gesture. Inside, a miniature portrait of Sebastian, eyes soft yet intense, seemed to watch her as though across the miles, across the months, across the chasm of misunderstanding that had defined their lives. Eleanor pressed the locket to her lips, feeling warmth bloom in her chest, an unspoken dialogue resonating with every beat of her heart. She understood, in that exquisite intimacy, that Sebastian's intentions had been sincere from the outset, that his coldness had been a mask for the uncertainty, fear, and restraint imposed by his station. The locket was not merely a gift but a confession, a promise of reconciliation tempered by time, care, and unspoken devotion. Yet even this gesture, glorious and heartfelt, could not dissolve all hesitation. Eleanor wrestled with the fear of returning, with the weight of society's judgment, with the knowledge that she carried not only hope but a child whose life would be intertwined with scandal if revealed prematurely. She recognized that the path forward required courage and deliberation, a confrontation with both the man she loved and the world that sought to constrain her. Pride, dignity, and the safety of her unborn child were all in delicate balance, each demanding respect, each capable of shifting the fragile equilibrium of her heart. In the evenings, Eleanor would rehearse imagined conversations, voicing both accusation and forgiveness to the empty air of her drawing room. She would allow herself moments of anger, flashes of despair, and yet invariably she returned to the understanding that had begun to blossom through Sebastian's careful gestures. He had never betrayed her, and the silence that had wounded her so deeply had been a cruel accident of circumstance, compounded by the unyielding expectations of nobility. She was, in a sense, both victim and participant in the tragedy of misunderstanding, and she felt the bittersweet tension of this duality with exquisite clarity. Finally, as the year waned toward its end, Eleanor made her choice. She would return to the palace, not in anger or reproach, but with quiet authority, with the undeniable truth of life she carried, and with the intention of confronting the man who had once seemed distant, now revealed to be both fallible and profoundly human. The journey promised confrontation and revelation, yet it was imbued with the potential for reconciliation, for rediscovery, and for love tempered by time and trial. She gathered the letters, the locket, the pressed flowers, each token a talisman against fear, each proof of enduring affection a shield against the uncertainties ahead. As she prepared to depart, a final, tremulous thought seized her. The world she left would no longer receive her in innocence, and Sebastian would confront truths far beyond his letters and tokens, truths capable of altering both their hearts and their destinies. The child within her was silent now, yet its presence resonated with all the urgency, intimacy, and unspoken promise of a bond waiting to be acknowledged. Eleanor's gaze swept the horizon one last time, noting the frost upon the meadows, the stillness of the stream, the skeletal beauty of the trees, and the fragile brilliance of winter sunlight catching each icy branch. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the return that would demand every measure of courage, every ounce of grace, and every pulse of hope she possessed. Her footsteps, deliberate and unwavering, carried her toward the carriage that would bear her back into the world of expectations, misunderstandings, and the man whose heart she still longed to reclaim. The letters, the tokens, the locket, all whispers of affection, apology, and unspoken love, were now in her hands, ready to confront the one who had unknowingly been both her tormentor and her salvation. A delicate shiver of anticipation and fear ran through her as the landscape of her exile blurred behind her, leaving only the uncertain path forward, where truth, revelation, and the fragile promise of reconciliation awaited. The carriage doors swung open, and Eleanor's breath caught as the palace she had fled a year ago loomed before her eyes, its familiar grandeur now tinged with both anticipation and dread. The air seemed heavier here, charged with the weight of unspoken words and a year's absence. She stepped onto the cobblestones, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots, and felt the pulse of her own courage quicken. Every detail of the palace recalled memories she had tried to bury, the sweeping staircases, the carved balustrades, the hollow echo of footsteps across marble floors, but none of it mattered as much as the man waiting within. Sebastian's silhouette appeared near the drawing room window, framed in pale winter sunlight, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended between past heartbreak and the possibility of reconciliation. Her heart thundered. This was the confrontation she had rehearsed, the reckoning of every doubt, every tear, every stolen moment of longing that had defined the past 12 months. She entered the hall with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, the rustle of her gown a quiet testament to her dignity. Servants, discreet as ever, bowed their heads, whispers trailing in her wake, but Eleanor barely noticed them. All her attention was fixed on the man who had haunted her thoughts and shaped her year of solitude. Sebastian stood with his back to the fire, tall, statuesque, yet somehow vulnerable in a way that made her pulse quicken. His eyes, when he turned toward her, were a mixture of shock, longing, and a recognition that transcended mere words. In that instant, Eleanor felt the fragile bridge between distance and connection tremble under the weight of unspoken emotion. He stepped forward, slow and careful, as if each motion required negotiation with both pride and longing. "Lady Eleanor," he said, voice low and measured, yet carrying a tremor she had never expected, "you have returned." The simplicity of the statement belied the storm behind it, and Eleanor felt her heart clench with a mixture of anger, relief, and anticipation. She had imagined countless conversations, countless accusations and confessions, yet hearing the words spoken aloud made her realize the gulf that remained between intention and understanding. She held the locket tightly in her gloved hand, the miniature portrait of Sebastian pressing against her palm, a tangible proof of the years' silent dialogue, the tokens of remorse and hope that had traversed the distance between them. "Sebastian," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "I have returned not in anger, but with truth in my hands and life within me. A year has passed and yet some questions remain unanswered, some understanding yet to be reached." Her gaze did not waver, and in her eyes he saw not only resolve but a subtle vulnerability that spoke of love tempered by trial. Sebastian's lips parted slightly as though he wished to speak, and yet the weight of the moment, the depth of the year's separation, left him searching for words adequate to the intensity of his feelings. His hand reached for hers, tentative and reverent, the space between them charged with every letter, every flower, every gloved token of care and apology that had arrived in her absence. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the subtle tension between pride and longing, between regret and hope. Sebastian's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and tremulous. "Eleanor, I have been a fool of circumstance and caution. Every hesitation, every measured distance, was not born of indifference but of fear of failing you, of misreading propriety, of exposing my heart to judgment before I was certain it could bear the weight of yours." His confession was both apology and revelation, and Eleanor felt the years of misunderstanding crystallize into clarity. She allowed herself a breath she had been holding for months, a moment of recognition that the man before her was as fallible as he was sincere, as human as he was noble. Her gaze softened yet remained resolute. "Sebastian, a year has given me understanding as well. I have learned that silence can wound as deeply as betrayal, and that fear can masquerade as distance. I do not come to reproach, but to offer the truth of what has been concealed. I carry your child, the living evidence of our union, and with it, the hope of a life restored, should you choose to embrace it." The words hung between them, weighty, delicate, irrevocable. Sebastian's eyes darkened with a mixture of awe, disbelief and burgeoning joy, and he took a step closer, bridging the distance with cautious reverence. He reached for her hand, sliding his fingers around hers with the gentlest pressure, as if afraid that force might shatter the fragile trust now being reconstructed. "Your courage humbles me, Eleanor," he whispered, his lips barely brushing her knuckles. "I have failed in ways I scarcely understood, and yet here you stand, offering not only forgiveness but life itself. How can I deserve such grace?" Her heart swelled at the vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty that contrasted so sharply with the formality of his station. It was a moment suspended in time, a delicate interplay of confession, reconciliation, and the tentative stirrings of hope. Sebastian's gaze fell to her abdomen, where life had grown quietly, protected from the world. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. The child was both a bond and a promise, a living testament to their connection that no distance, no misunderstanding, and no societal expectation could sever. "Our child," he murmured, awe-laden, "and yet, you chose to return despite the years of silence, despite all that might have been lost." Eleanor nodded, her own eyes glistening with the weight of unspoken emotion. "I returned because truth and love demand it," she said softly. "Because the heart cannot remain in exile when life calls it home." The room seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves understood the significance of the moment. They spoke no further, allowing silence to articulate the reconciliation words could not capture, the tender acknowledgement of faults, the unspoken promise of care, the fragile bridge of trust being rebuilt between two souls previously divided by misunderstanding. Every glance, every subtle motion carried weight, an intimacy more profound than any overt gesture. Eleanor felt a surge of hope, a warmth that bloomed within her, yet it was tempered by the awareness of the delicate balance she now navigated. The path forward was bright with promise but also fraught with the responsibilities of life, love, and society's watchful gaze. Then quietly Sebastian guided her to a chair by the hearth, his hand steady yet reverent. "Let us speak of what has been, of what may come," he said, his voice imbued with both command and tenderness. Eleanor allowed herself to be seated, the locket resting against her chest, a tangible emblem of the year's unspoken dialogue. Words flowed between them, carefully measured, yet charged with the intensity of months lived apart, of misunderstandings endured, of emotions held captive by fear and propriety. Each phrase, each sigh, each glance built upon the last, constructing a foundation for trust, for understanding, and for a love renewed with the clarity of truth. Hours passed unnoticed. The fire dwindled to embers, casting a soft glow over their joined hands, over the lines of reconciliation etched into their faces. Eleanor spoke of her year in exile, of the letters she had never sent, of the child growing within her, of the private grief and hope that had sustained her. Sebastian listened with rapt attention, occasionally pressing her hand, occasionally closing his eyes in private confession, as though acknowledging the depth of both regret and joy. It was an intimacy beyond words, a communion of hearts that transcended the constraints of society, duty, and prior misunderstanding. At last, Eleanor rose, her own hand resting over her abdomen, a quiet gesture of both protection and pride. "We must face the world," she said softly yet firmly, "but let it be as it may. What we share here now is ours, untainted by rumor, fear, or time lost. The rest is consequence we will bear together." Sebastian's gaze softened, shadowed with awe, and he pressed a kiss to her hand, lingering with reverence. "Together," he whispered, the single word a binding vow, a promise to navigate every challenge, every expectation, every whisper of society with hearts aligned, with love restored, and with a future that could no longer be denied. And yet, as they stood together, hands intertwined, the enormity of their shared secret, the child who would forever link their hearts, loomed ahead. Outside the palace walls, the world waited, full of expectation, judgment, and the unrelenting passage of time. The first step toward public reconciliation had been taken, but the path forward remained uncertain, and every heartbeat carried the fragile tension of what would be revealed next. Eleanor and Sebastian, bound by courage, truth, and enduring affection, faced the dawn of both a private reunion and a public reckoning. The moment the carriage wheels echoed across the palace courtyard, Eleanor felt a surge of both dread and triumph, as if the entire weight of a year's separation pressed upon her chest. The gates, massive and imposing, swung open with a solemn creak, revealing the familiar stone facades that had once seemed suffocating and now appeared both daunting and inviting. She stepped onto the cobblestones, her gown brushing lightly against the frost-sparkled stones, and felt a shiver of anticipation. Every detail of the palace, every echoing footstep, reminded her of absence and misunderstanding, yet she walked with quiet authority, carrying not only herself but the living proof of a bond that had endured even distance and silence. Sebastian awaited her in the grand hall, the firelight flickering across his face, highlighting the tension, hope, and restrained joy that danced in his expression. At the sight of Eleanor, radiant yet composed, the weight of months apart seemed to dissolve, leaving only the ache of anticipation and relief. She held the child close, swaddled in soft linens, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around her own. The sight of their son, a living embodiment of their connection, stole the breath from Sebastian's lungs. His eyes, wide and unguarded, reflected awe, disbelief, and a love that had only deepened through absence. For a heartbeat, the grandeur of the palace, the whispers of servants, and the expectations of nobility vanished, leaving only the three of them suspended in a fragile, perfect moment. "Eleanor," Sebastian's voice was low, resonant, trembling with emotion, "you have returned. You have returned with our son." Each word trembled under the gravity of what he beheld, as though the realization of fatherhood and reconciliation was too vast for simple speech. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, her own emotions a careful mixture of hope, pride, and vulnerability. "Yes," she said softly, "he is ours. I have returned not to accuse, not to demand, but to offer truth, life, and a chance to begin again." The child stirred in her arms, a small, innocent heartbeat echoing the profound reality of their bond. Sebastian's hands, hesitant at first, reached toward the child with reverence, brushing a gentle finger along the tiny knuckles. In that moment, the palace walls seemed to embrace them, witnesses to a reunion that transcended misunderstanding, time, and pride. The courtiers, gathered discreetly at the edges of the hall, began to stir, whispers threading through the air like silk ribbons. Eleanor and Sebastian remained oblivious, wrapped in a cocoon of intimacy and reconciliation. The tension between them, built over months of miscommunication and Distance dissolved into a quiet understanding. Every gesture, from the careful placement of a hand upon the child's head to the subtle incline of Eleanor's gaze toward Sebastian, carried volumes more than words could express. Pride and fear, previously interwoven into their interactions, now gave way to vulnerability and trust. The child, a tiny beacon of life and hope, served as both symbol and bridge, anchoring their hearts together in ways that neither grandeur nor gossip could unravel. Sebastian knelt before Eleanor, eyes never leaving the child, voice trembling as he spoke. "I failed you," he said, each word deliberate, weighted with sincerity, "through silence, through distance, through the misjudgments of my own fear and pride. Yet here you are, bearing the proof of our bond, and I am left with no choice but to place my heart entirely in your hands, trusting that you will guide us both toward a life worthy of him." Eleanor's lips curved in a soft, trembling smile, and she allowed herself a moment to exhale, the tension of a year's solitude loosening its grip. "Sebastian," she whispered, "it is not only your heart that must trust but ours as well. Let this child be the bridge, the reason, the living testimony that love endures when nurtured with courage, patience, and truth." The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the hall, shadows that seemed to echo the complexities of their emotions, long months of doubt, the ache of separation, and now the quiet bloom of reconciliation. Eleanor placed the child in Sebastian's arms, her fingers brushing his as he cradled the small form against his chest. The room was still, save for the soft cooing of the child and the faint rustle of silk gowns. Each heartbeat felt monumental, marking the passage from grief and misunderstanding to acceptance and renewed love. Sebastian's eyes glistened as he looked up at Eleanor, the tension between pride and tenderness dissolved into something rare and exquisite, unguarded devotion. In the days that followed, the palace seemed to transform with their reunion. Rooms once cold with the weight of absence now echoed with quiet laughter, gentle conversations, and the tender routines of family. Eleanor, previously isolated in the countryside, now moved through the halls with quiet grace, her presence a balm to every corner. Sebastian, formerly constrained by propriety and fear of misstep, allowed himself moments of spontaneity, tender gestures that spoke volumes to both his wife and child. Courtiers and servants watched with admiration, whispers now filled with awe and gentle curiosity, not scandal. The palace, a vessel of both history and society's expectation, had been reshaped by love restored, forgiveness granted, and the undeniable proof of life that united their hearts irrevocably. Evenings were spent near the hearth, the child nestled between them, warmth and quiet conversation filling the once solemn rooms. Eleanor spoke softly of the months in exile, of the private letters, the flowers, and the tokens that had sustained her. Sebastian listened, absorbing every detail, allowing his hands to linger over hers, tracing the years of sorrow, longing, and eventual triumph in the simple motion of touch. They had navigated the treacherous waters of pride, societal expectation, and misunderstanding, and now found themselves anchored in the steady, enduring rhythm of family, love, and shared truth. Yet even in this bliss, the fragility of the moment was not lost on Eleanor. She knew the outside world awaited, poised to judge, to question, to whisper. The reconciliation she had achieved in private was a delicate treasure, one that required care, discretion, and courage to present publicly. Sebastian, attuned to her unspoken concerns, pressed a kiss to her hand, a silent promise that together, they could navigate both affection and scrutiny. "We face them together," he murmured, voice steady, eyes bright with determination. "Our child, our love, our truth, they cannot undo what we have endured and rebuilt." Eleanor nodded, a subtle smile curving her lips, her heart buoyed by the certainty of shared resolve. The final moment of quiet triumph came as they prepared to walk through the palace corridors, introducing their child to the household formally. Each step was deliberate, composed, yet carried the weight of triumph over misunderstanding, courage over fear, and love over separation. Courtiers, previously poised with polite curiosity, now bowed with genuine respect, their whispers softened into murmurs of admiration. Eleanor and Sebastian moved with synchronized grace, a united front, their child the living symbol of endurance, devotion, and hope. The palace, once a place of cold grandeur and distant expectation, now radiated warmth, laughter, and the tender chaos of new beginnings. As they reached the grand hall, Eleanor paused, her gaze sweeping over the ornate walls, the tapestries depicting centuries of triumph and sorrow, the echo of footsteps carrying the weight of history. She tightened her hold on Sebastian's hand, feeling the steady warmth of his presence, the unspoken promise of protection and partnership. Their child stirred in Sebastian's arms, tiny eyes blinking up at them both, a silent witness to the culmination of trials endured, love rediscovered, and a future now firmly anchored in truth and devotion. Eleanor exhaled, the tension of uncertainty melting, replaced by the delicate bloom of hope. And yet, even in this triumph, the palace gates remained closed to rumor, the world outside unaware of the depth of emotion, reconciliation, and courage that had brought them to this moment. Eleanor's heart, though full of love, knew that each public step, each introduction, carried a subtle risk, the delicate balance of propriety and truth, of expectation and genuine affection. She looked at Sebastian, and in the shared glance, both recognized the truth. Their love had endured, their bond had been tested, and yet the final chapter of acceptance and public acknowledgement remained just ahead, shimmering with possibility and poised to define the legacy of both heart and family.